While there are great maps in the 20-year history of the Battlefield franchise, there are also others that are dramatically imbalanced, poorly laid out, or simply disasters of design. This is the story of the worst maps of Battlefield. There are numerous reasons why I haven't covered any Bad Company 2 maps thus far. Chief among these is a limited experience with the game during its prime years. It is my commitment to quality and objective fact that I prefer to avoid videos on topics where my knowledge can be fuzzy. A second, more practical issue is simply that the game has no free camera or spectator feature to speak of, crippling my ability to contextualize map layouts and provide the proper cinematic views. That being said, I am finally going to give this a shot, because after all these years, the game has sustained a large enough population to adequately provide me with a good understanding, and more importantly, some maps just need to be thrashed. So, if you will forgive the camera angles and first-person observations, let's get to it. Bad Company 2 was a game in which Rush was the premier multiplayer mode, and the game was far better for it. With a limited player count maxing out at 32 even on PC, and levels tailored toward that experience, the gameplay was often exemplary, intimate, and enjoyable, by far the greatest implementation of Rush to this day. Conquest was not forgotten, though it did play a backseat role. On some maps where the boundaries were slightly shifted, it did work, though it rarely felt like anything other than a big TDM given the level scaling, and could even be weird since Rush was the main design intent. Yet, 3 maps in particular would make it into the game that would be Conquest exclusive. These were Panama Canal, Laguna Alta, and the monstrosity known as Heavy Metal. The focus on Rush, combined with the lower player count, already made Bad Company 2 different in its design, and vehicles would also play a much less important role than in previous titles. They were limited in number, and designed differently as well, being more, immersive and realistic, heavier, difficult to control, and yet powerful. They were also annoying as they often created a lot of screen shake with their weapons. As such, the game never had more than a few per map, usually a tank or IFV or two, and sometimes with an added attack helicopter, though that's a whole other can of worms to discuss. All this in mind, eventually it was decided to give players a vehicle-focused map in the form of Heavy Metal. Perhaps to fill a missing Battlefield void, or just to see what would happen, the map would launch in Bad Company 2's final map pack about 9 months after release, and be the game's largest by far. Heavy Metal was named for the game's 7th single-player mission. Not surprising, as much of the map was lifted directly from that campaign level, maintaining a lot of the terrain and environment features, many of the buildings, and background city set piece. Changes are few, like a reduction in trees, smoke effects, and an increase in fog, minimizing rendering demand of the full landscape. Fully intended to be the only major vehicle map in the game, each deployment provides 2 tanks, 1 transport helicopter, and 1 attack helicopter, also making it the only level where both factions' helicopters are available simultaneously. The map is linear and enormous, even as mainline Battlefield games go. It is set in a large valley with a single dirt road winding its way through. All other terrain is mostly exposed plains, with a few rolling hills and rock walls providing the only cover, if you can call it that. A small house can be found here and there, but the only major areas of protection are the cluster of buildings that make up the 3 objectives, and they are distant. There is actually not much to say about these objectives. They are almost piece for piece pulled from the campaign mission. A few rocks and tank traps can be found close by on each, and well, they are a collection of buildings. The C point has 3 structures and a shack. A on the opposite end has about the same amount, but is more fleshed out with extra assets, debris, and small details. Each of these gimme objectives spawns a bonus light transport, and if in control of the local faction, a bonus tank. Each of these flags is rarely fought over, owing to their massive distance away from each other, proximity to each team's deployment, and the exposed landscape. The B flag in the map's center is the largest objective, with enough buildings to form a small village. A substantial hill on the southwest of the point creates a line of sight block for ground armor, and a huge advantage for the controlling team as it provides cover, a verticality advantage, and head glitch opportunities for recon players and engineers firing rockets at tanks. Sniper battles nearby are common, and the controlling team is usually entrenched, making it difficult to recapture. The point provides extra stationary defenses, a recon drone station, and another bonus tank for the owning faction, making it extremely valuable and is the focus of the entire map. Pushing beyond it rarely occurs because of its terrain advantage, of the distance to the next objective, the empty space in between, and the arrival of new heavy vehicles coming from that direction, including the enemy attack helicopter, which can mop up anything that moves and has a tendency to hover near the ceiling above the gimme objectives. In a typical round, each team has their 3 tanks and helicopters continually pressing from each side of the B objective, with one team holding that bonus tank. Infantry would be left to roam the empty fields in between on foot, or try speeding through with one of the jeeps. But whether walking or driving, getting cut down in the process was common, either from the center high ground or targeted by a wild player or two who used the helicopters to bail perfectly on top of one of the immense wind turbines. The linear layout of the map already makes this style of game frustrating for many, but the vehicle drivers had problems of their own. The amount of armor necessitates the use of engineer kits and rockets. Surprisingly, tanks had little protection against the vast quantities of Carl Gustav rockets with their speed and high damage, or the maneuverability of the AT-4, which made targeting easier in the open plain. Countermeasures to these did not exist like in future titles, and customization options were limited to only one specification at a time. Additionally, there was always an even greater threat in the frequent use of the tracer dart pistol, which was available to all classes. The projectile was fast, had almost no drop, and would provide a lockable target similar to how SOFLAMs operate in later titles. When locked, the Carl Gustav rocket had enormous range, and self-guided to the target shortly after launch. This brief delay meant that rockets could be locked on and then fired from well behind cover, even straight up over hills, essentially turning it into a javelin launcher. The only protection against this was the pop smoke option on the tanks and the flares of the helicopters, both of which would not break the lock of incoming rockets, but it would clear the active dart's homing effects. As the smokescreen was one of many specializations, players had to decide between that, the coaxial LMG, more armor, stronger rounds, proximity sensors, a faster reload, or better optics. Given the many more proactive options, this resulted in the tracer dart pistol becoming more effective and prevalent here than on any other Bad Company 2 map. Compounding this was the strength enemies had with incredible sightlines, who were usually just peeking over the hills and were extremely difficult to spot due to the blue-tinted fuzzy TV screen that armor were designed with. Part of this problem stems from the fact that vehicles were never intended to be utilized like this in Bad Company 2, and even on rush maps their effectiveness is highly governed by tight layouts and available cover to rock behind. The transport helicopters, on the other hand, feel wasted, as when they fly too low, rockets and tank shells blast them out of the sky, while the linear design forces them in the direction of the enemy attack helicopter. The map boundary which constricts the action is also questionable, especially in its center. While there exists a few scattered rock piles on higher ground to offer protection, nothing comes close to the cliff northeast of the B objective. This position provides second-to-none sightlines, cover, and a ranged advantage against all types of enemy. It also permits the call-in of recon mortar strikes practically anywhere on the map. Control of the B objective always makes it a critical location, and one which can be infuriating, especially for the US team. Astonishingly, there is a steady slope on the Russian side running along the map border granting access to the position, but it simply doesn't exist on the opposite end. Intentional or otherwise, the US side has no slope. What they do have is a sharp cliff, which, with enough glitchy jumping, players can mount and eventually make it to the top, though they are forced to go out of bounds in the process. This is simply a terrain feature which never should have been accessible, and demonstrates just one issue with porting a campaign level. Arguably a very slow-paced map, Heavy Metal emits a feeling of an older refractor engine title, wherein no matter if you have a vehicle or are forced to walk, the distance to the next battle is considerable. Getting killed at any point on your journey, a definite possibility given the focus on engineer and recon and the wide open sightlines, forces you to reenact that same experience over and over. An extra flag between each gimme and the center point would have made this far more manageable. It is one thing to say that the map's intention is for both teams to collide in the map's center, or play tug-of-war along the fields from one base to the next, but in this, it doesn't succeed. Teams really don't collide. They wander in one piece at a time, be it a lone tank or jeep, or a brave soul crossing the abyss. Because of the massive scale and limited numbers of spread out players out in the valley, the back flags become almost useless, rarely being attacked or defended, and only slow the game down further. Of course, these positions were there originally from the single player level, and this is ultimately Heavy Metal's greatest problem. Pulling entire levels from a campaign for multiplayer use rarely ends well. It's not a matter of it being cost effective, I'm all for using any assets if they're available. Rather, it's about the obvious fact that one is designed for solo play and the other isn't. Balance, immersion, map detail, terrain, breakout potential, distance between objectives. These are substantially incongruous between campaign and multiplayer, even if drastic changes are made, and they usually are. Using single-player environments as major backgrounds and set pieces is completely acceptable and encouraged, but as for the layout itself, it should be completely original and designed for the multiplayer experience and every nuance therein. If you enjoy Heavy Metal, that is completely fine and I cannot take that away. As with any map, exciting things can and do happen, and is even more likely here since it offers the greatest sandbox gameplay available. In that regard, I am not arguing against such a vehicular design's inclusion, but rather the form it took. A large, vehicle-heavy multiplayer level is a good thing for the game to have, as it is a Battlefield title after all. But this one feels forced and out of place in Bad Company 2, especially one of that scale and emptiness. The lackluster design and loadout options of the tanks and helicopters don't help things, as they are clearly meant for different implementations. But it's not all disappointing. Even though Heavy Metal fails in its role, it helped pave the way for the actual best vehicle maps in the game, those that were created for the Vietnam DLC, and which hit most of the correct notes that were missing in this barren experiment.